this morning we have a great combination of uh, speakers with expertise in psychiatry, Buddhism, and motivational speaking, self-awareness, mindfulness. These are all topics that we have all been discussing and we have been fascinated about because we come from a culture that is increasingly maybe applying pressure on us, and we have been trying out different ways of dealing with this modern life that we are immersed in. So I think this is going to be a great start to the day when we talk about these topics and think about how we can overcome um, the pressure of modern life. Right. So we have here with us Joe and Veronica, who have a lot of experience working in this field. Let us start today's discussions with hearing from them about their work and what brought them to this field and how they've been contributing to it.
Hi, good morning, everyone. This is Veronica. And by the way, I'm very excited to be in India. This is my second time in this country. The first time I came when I was in my 20s backpacking. And back then I told myself I will be back one day, but I didn't know that I would be back as an author. So it's pretty incredible. And it was Kerala as well. So a little bit about my background. I used to be a corporate girl. I worked in big Fortune 500 corporations for quite a few years. I worked for Apple. I worked for Estee Lauder, always in Hong Kong. I'm originally from Spain, but from a very, very young age, from the age of 5, I always moved countries with my family because of my dad's job. So when I was 5, we moved to France. When I was 11, we moved to Brazil. I've lived in Italy as well. And when I was in my early 20s, I decided to go on an adventure. And I went with a one-way ticket to Taiwan to learn Chinese. So since then, I've lived in Taiwan. I learned Chinese. I learned Mandarin. I moved to China at a time where China was very closed. And it was not easy, I tell you, to be the only woman as a single woman in a completely different culture. And after that, I moved to Hong Kong. So I've been in Asia really half of my life. And so I said I was a corporate girl, but I'm no longer that. And what happened is during the pandemic, and I know that we all have a story of the pandemic, I was locked abroad of my country, of Hong Kong. I have 2 little girls who back then were 3 and 4 years old. And I left on holidays, what was supposed to be a holiday, with the 2 of them. And when we arrived in Spain, they changed the quarantine regulation and we were locked abroad. And they say that challenge is always opens the door for opportunities. And that was definitely the case for me. So for a year, we were locked abroad. My husband was back in Hong Kong. My dog was there. We were not able to come back. So we ended up moving to Australia, which is where my husband is from. And it's during that period, I'm telling you all this story to explain why I'm here today, because I wasn't able to find a job. I was a foreigner in a new country. I have an accent, as you can tell. I didn't have a network. And I felt very excluded. But what I realized is that even though I wasn't able to find a job, I was able to add value, and I was able to share my story, and I was able to write, and I was able to reach people by creating my own channels. And it's only then, and this is only 2.5 years ago, that I started writing, and I started speaking in public, and I started doing podcasts in my 40s. I had never done any of that before. And very often opportunities, they come from these lemons, right? And that's why my entire philosophy is called the lemon tree mindset. Because in English, we say that when life gives you lemons, you should make lemonade. I would challenge and say that, yes, you should make lemonade. And what about if you take the seeds and you plant your own lemon tree? And so all of this story is to explain why and how I've used all this corporate experience and this life experience and this cultural experience to find a way to add value. I think that there are a lot of things that can be improved in the corporate world, that can be improved in the way that businesses are run, in the way that corporations treat people. And so that's why I'm here today. And my focus has been on cultural agility and how to make sure that when we work in these cultural environments like we are doing today, we are able to see it as an advantage and turn our cultures from barriers into bridges. So that's why I'm here today. Thank you.
Thank you, Veronica. Is this working? Can you? Yeah. Okay. Great. So yeah, great to be here. Thank you for sharing your journey, and I relate in many ways. I grew up in Switzerland, actually in the French-speaking part of Switzerland, and then my parents moved back to the U.S. where they were from. They were originally from Italy, right, from southern Italy. Um, and they're sort of pursuing the American dream. My dad was going to medical school in Europe, and it was a real culture shock. And what I realized was that the culture that I was exposed to when I arrived in the U.S. didn't feel right. It felt very wrong. Right? It did not feel like something I could connect with. And my parents' involvement in the sort of busyness of achieving, succeeding, really, to me, felt like a tremendous loss, right? A tremendous, like the American dream really felt like a nightmare, right? And, so at that time I didn't really understand why I felt that way or how I felt that way, right? But as I sort of came to explore, I had certain experiences, right? Experiences you might call I was raised, Catholic, and you might call them a visitation or an awakening from a Buddhist point of view. Experiences of connection to nature or connection to other, to all life, that really gave me a sense of hope or promise. And then eventually I found writing. I found the poetry of Whitman and Cummings and Eliot, and I started writing myself. I started writing poetry. There's another way to be that I could sense and glimpse. And of course, that the world around me, including my family, really wasn't going to tell me about that. But there were a lot of things at the time that I didn't know. I didn't know that my mother kept a book of poetry, Emily Dickinson's or Dante's poetry by her bedside, and my father kept a book of, Thomas à Kempis, about imitating Christ. So their traditions, they sort of hid from me, trying to turn me into an American. They didn't speak Italian in the home. They spoke only English. So I was being sort of deprived of my roots, but also importantly, the roots that gave me the sense, somehow they were still in me, and it gave me the sense that there was another way to be. So eventually I went to college and ran into, I was interested in Jung, because, the culture Western culture, which I've had to try to understand at great length being exposed to it, is a culture of extremes. It's a dualistic culture, right? So there's modern materialism, scientific materialism, which my dad believed in, right? He was a doctor. My mom, there's a kind of, what I would call religious supremacy. You want to call it, white Christian European supremacy, a sense that the Europeans are the chosen people, which has sort of fueled the colonialism. And both of these, however, to me felt, while it seemed like they were complete opposites, they were telling me that, I didn't have, I was like a machine, right? I was a sort of robot that didn't have the capacity to free myself or awaken or understand reality. I needed science to tell me what was true. I needed technology to make me happy. And likewise, I think the spiritual tradition I came from was really based on, the sense that you have original sin and only God can help you, really understand what's true or find peace and happiness. So when I went to college, I ran into my first Buddhist teacher, who was actually the first white Buddhist, Tibetan Buddhist monk. He became a monk in the 60s, and then eventually came to the US again to teach Tibetan Buddhism. And I found a culture there that felt very much at home. It felt resonant, it felt alive, it felt very empowering, right? Because it was a culture that was saying, you have what it takes, and your sense of the sort of modern scientific, cultural, supremacist, culture that that I was exposed to, isn't really the only alternative, and it isn't really the most nurturing or wise. And I also came to discover that, part of the roots that I had talked about Eastern culture, that in a way the culture I was coming from, like Veronica, coming from Spanish culture, the Southern Italian culture is much closer in a lot of ways to Indian culture than it is to Anglo-American culture. It's more rooted. My father was born a few miles from the place where Pythagoras taught, and my mother was born a few miles from the place where Empedocles taught. And both of them were vegetarian. They both believed in reincarnation. They believed in nonviolence. And somehow that wisdom or that ancient sense of grounding had seeped into my psyche, so that I oriented toward it through Buddhism. I sort of found my roots through going to Asia and discovering, India, what I call India's exportable culture. Buddhism was Indian culture exported to the rest of Asia, that allowed me to really bridge, the scientific way of approaching the psyche, understanding how we can live in our minds and bodies, live well, free them of the limitations of our own demons, of our self-protective stress instincts and trauma instincts, and how we can awaken our full capacity to be human. And so that's, how I'm here. And I just want to say I feel very much at home in this. I first came to India when I was 25, which was a long time ago. And I've been back many times, but I've never been to the South. So this is a real privilege for me, as well as, this community focused on creativity and literature and writing and sort of being human, essentially. How do we learn how to be human? Resonates very deeply with me, so I'm really happy to be here. I was at one of the talks I was at yesterday. One of the poets, Francis Combe, a French poet, was talking about his understanding of poetry is really where we can be open to our capacity to love, right, and connect with others with an open mind and an open heart. And to me, this is kind of the opposite of the culture, the dominant culture that I was exposed to and raised in, and that's, colonized most of the world, right? Which is, disconnect the head, what you think, what you should be doing, from the heart and from the body. And this is a big source of our stress, is that the culture itself is trying to disconnect us from our own wholeness, our own well-being. And what's most important there is our capacity to not just be like atomic individuals, separate from everyone and everything else, but our capacity to connect. And that requires an open mind, and it requires an open heart. And so this is the kind of wisdom that I had to come to India to discover. Particularly, I'm happy to be in South India because it's the sort of locality where a great teacher, Nagarjuna, came from. In Buddhist culture, he's considered to be a second Buddha. And he taught a very, very simple but profound non-dualism, which of course is, the foundation of most Indian spirituality and philosophy and culture. And that's, like, to me, the perfect remedy, right? And particularly one phrase of his resonates both with the definition of poetry Francis gave yesterday and with the sense of the wisdom traditions that I needed. That he said, we're looking for the practice. The Buddha teaches many teachings, depending on his students. And to some he teaches to abstain from vice, to some to cultivate virtue, to some he teaches teachings based on dualism, right? That is, be free yourself, get out of your bondage, and to some teachings of non-dualism. And so how did he define this? Was his essential message of non-duality was it's the Birubhijanam, the Bodhisadhanam, Shunyata Karuna Garbham. That is the practice, the awe-inspiring practice of enlightenment or awakening, which is the essence of which is the openness that is the womb of compassion. That's how he defined it, right? So that understanding that we need to not have our mind filled with knowledge. We need to learn how to keep our minds open to each other, to learning, to the new. And likewise, we need to let our hearts, our natural capacity to care for ourselves and others be the center or the touchstone of our lives, the healing point of our lives. So that's, essentially a little, story, of how I got here and why I feel, in a way, this is my spiritual home.
Fascinating to listen to how the West and the East that boundaries have been effaced, and how Eastern philosophy is blending with the Western culture and producing these great ideas. When we live in South India or anywhere in the world, we are caught in the space between this so-called East and the West, success on one side and the need for self-awareness on the other side. Everybody is aware that we need to care and we need to be mindful, but the pressure of performance and success and achievements is so much that we get crushed in between. Do you think we are losing out on this, what we call maybe social capital? We don't trust people anymore. We don't care anymore. We are not tolerant anymore, leading to a lot of strife and violence. And are we slowly becoming incapable of all this, despite all the discussions we have on the other side? Because I feel that somewhere happiness and mindfulness are also getting commodified. They're also getting packaged in some ways. That is the necessary evil side of it, because you have to write about it, you have to talk about it, and then it's getting commodified. So how do we really negotiate? I'm sure this is a universal problem. You feel guilty writing and talking about it also, because I am also doing life coaching and skill development, and similar to what you are also doing, and I feel guilty because am I really helping them, or I'm just making money out of it? Kind of question arises. How do you really negotiate that?
My experience in the corporate world is that when you look at these big corporations, they all try to drive the P&L, the profit and loss. So they're all chasing results, and they have a lot of pressure from Wall Street and from the investors and so on. And so what we tend to do is we try to focus on how to get there and how to achieve those results. And so very often what we tend to do is to cut on people. So let me give you an example. Very often in these corporations, when it's the end of the quarter, for example, and you need to reach a target, the first thing that many companies are going to cut on is on people. It's on personal development time, it's on training, for example, it's on things that impact people. Now, the interesting thing, though, is that it's actually by investing more in people and by spending time with people. And if you are a leader, is instead of spending an hour in the next meeting with the board, is going to your teams one by one and having those individual conversations and understanding what they're struggling with and where they need help. And that is actually what, ironically, is what's going to help move the needle, is by really prioritizing people, is by really prioritizing the well-being individually, the well-being collectively. And so, yes, very often we go into that direction, but I think there is an opportunity to really understand that when we prioritize people, what happens is those people, they feel listened. Those people, they feel heard. They feel that the manager cares, which is one of the main reasons why people leave or don't leave their work. I did so many surveys of people living in the organization, and the number one reason is because of their boss. And so if we're able to turn this around and be the leader who cares and the leader who is patient and the leader who is really trying to be there for the team, that actually impacts positively the P&L at the end of the day. You have more retention, you have people who feel that they belong, you're going to have less attrition, you're going to have people who feel motivated because there is someone who cares for them. So I don't have the answer, but I have seen how the leaders who get the best results are not the ones who are chasing those numbers and those metrics, but the ones who are really pushing their team up so that they raise individually and they raise collectively. So that has been my experience, and that's what I try to drive when I talk to leaders and corporations, and I really try to push a little bit the needle forward.
Thank you for that question. First of all, I can see that you are really helping because your students love you. I saw that. You know, I think there's a limit. We were at a talk yesterday where Chandran Nair was talking about the system, the culture, right? There's only so much you can do. There's some people have a little leeway because they have a sphere in which they can use their privilege and power to try to do something differently. But mostly the system is pushing us all in a certain direction, and it's not a good direction. And it's unless we really get radical and look at what are the roots of the problem, you know, I think, and part of that is really, I think, you know, understanding that this kind of scarcity mentality that values profit over people, right? Even profit over my own happiness. If I'm an executive, or, you know, I'm going to sacrifice I'm going to work overtime, sacrifice my family, my health, and you know, and at the end of it, I'll have something in the bank, is really, you know, it's a complete delusion. Really, it's a sickness. It's an addiction, a compulsion, and that's really what, you know, I think. One way that I've understood this is to reframe the way I was brainwashed to think of Western culture. Like Western culture is, you know, presents itself. I'm talking now about the Northwest, what I call the Far West. I'm talking about what part of Western culture that has colonized the planet has presented itself as the culmination of Greek and Roman history, the culmination of history, and the future of the planet. And the reality is, actually, for most of history, the West was completely behind every place else on the planet, certainly behind India, behind China, behind even the, you know, Persia, the ancient river valley civilizations. It was a poor country. It was you know, one of the poorest places on the planet. And this is part of the reason the kind of scarcity mentality and the willingness to break. So while Western culture presents its authority as a continuation of, say, Greek wisdom or Greek science, the reality is they're nothing like the Greek. Like, I know this is my culture. This is where I was born. My family is born in. Like, this kind of violence and mechanism and you know, greed is not Greek culture or even Latin culture, right? It just isn't. This is coming from, you know, an experience of scarcity, and it's really an illness. It's really an illness, and we need to understand fundamentally what's at the bottom of it is this materialism that says, you know, your happiness is not internal to you, it's in things, commodities, status, whatever. You know, at the same time, the religious teaching says, you know, you don't have what it takes to be happy. You have to rely on God. So it's really disempowering. Both sides of that culture are disempowering us as people. And we need to, so when I teach, I have a nonprofit. I was working at, you know, the fancy, you know, institutions, Columbia, Cornell, Harvard, all of these fancy institutions. And I realized I could not really teach what I needed to teach in those institutions. Because even though, you know, they pretend to be bastions of enlightenment, they're really bastions of this corporate mentality and conquest and to some extent exploiting humans, extracting, right? And so I created a nonprofit, and within the nonprofit, I called the Nalanda Institute, right, based on the great Buddhist university, the world's first university in North India, which had at its height an enrollment and faculty of 15,000 people, right? And it was only one of 4 great Buddhist universities in India that spread Indian culture in the form of Buddhism all around Asia, right? And it's something that's common to Vietnam, to Indonesia, to China, to Japan, to Central Asia, to Afghanistan. So these are, you know, this was a really important tradition, and what I'm trying to do is revive that. And of course, the essence of Buddhist teaching is you can't just meditate. Mindfulness alone is neutral. It actually won't, you know, it just, gives you a little more leeway to make a choice or to know what's happening. Like it gives you data or freedom, a pause. But if you don't know how to use that pause, or if you don't know like what direction you're going in, then it could make you a more unhappy person. You could be much more aware of how unhappy you are, which may not be a bad thing. It could be the beginning of a healing process. But you have to teach in Buddhism, and this is cuts across Hindu culture and yoga culture, and most traditional cultures, right? Is that, changing your mind state is not enough. You have to have wisdom and you have to have ethics. And these have to go together. And so in that context, when we teach mindfulness or compassion development or embodied practices, we also teach them together with understanding what is reality and looking at the fundamental questions of how I've been brainwashed and also how my own nervous system can trick me, right, into short selling myself and enclosing myself, right? And so I think that, this is the kind of, we need an education. We don't need just a training, a technique. Like we have to re-educate ourselves, and we have to re-educate ourselves in a radical way in order to resist this culture that's really kind of controlling the planet at this point. Yeah.
Two fascinating connections that came to me as I was listening to you was the way both capitalism and Eastern philosophy and Buddhism is all about the mind in two different ways. How capitalism gives us a certain P&L mindset, the approach or the philosophy that is focused on performance and gain, and how Buddhism or Eastern philosophy is the other side of it, which is also highly psychological, and you being a psychologist were telling us about it. The second thing that I was thinking about is how all the so-called everyday philosophy books like self-help books we call them, how they tell us about behavior, while what matters really is the mind, not how you behave or act, but the mind. I'm sure Veronica would also be able to throw light on that. When I talk to my students as a teacher, I keep telling them, don't just act like you have no pressure, don't just act like you have no problem, don't just negotiate with your problems, but actually get into a stage where there are no problems because you have the right way of thinking about it. How do you do that actually? Your mic is there.
Okay, so I'm going to share a story. And when I was in the corporate world, I had a burnout in the last company where I was at. But the interesting thing is that it took me almost a year. We're losing connection. It took me almost a year to be able to put my hand up and say, I'm not okay, I need help. And I think part of it is how we are educated and raised, especially in the West, to be strong and resilient, which is a good thing, but it's a good thing if it's balanced with honesty and vulnerability, because there's probably nothing worse than saying, I'm great, when deep inside you're feeling very weak and you're feeling hurt. And so when you're talking about mindfulness, I think the very first step is the self-awareness, to understand yourself, and understand if you need help, then the next step is to have that vulnerability to say, I need that help. Now, the problem is the system doesn't allow you to do that because there's shame and there's taboo. And if you say something like, oh, I'm not well, I'm having a burnout, you are put out of the system and you're kind of exiled out of the system because that's not what they want to hear. And so I think this goes back to how do we open the dialogue and how do we normalize and socialize that people are gonna, we're not machines, we are not P&Ls, we're gonna have moments where we are gonna need help. And if one of your employees at one point in time is struggling because life happens, they lost a loved one or they're having some personal issues, how to create an environment that does not push that person out but helps that person in. And that's where I think it's so important first to have self-awareness so that you can have that compassion towards yourself, but you can also have that compassion towards others. And I think that's the type of system that we're trying to create a system that is not pushing people out when they don't perform, but is more asking the whys and the how question. Not only why are you not performing, which is the current question, why are you not reaching the targets? How can I help you to get there? What do you need to be at your best? How can I be a better leader? And so it's that mindfulness is towards me, but it's toward those around me. And so that's my take on that topic.
Yeah, thanks, Veronica. And thanks for that question, Kalyani. I think that, the mind, first of all, modern science has still not succeeded in having even a definition of mind, right? So this is, and as somebody, as a psychiatrist, I went into medical school knowing I wanted to be a psychiatrist, and it was extremely discouraging, if not to say frustrating, that nobody talked about the mind. And nobody talked about a whole human being. It was just molecules, cells, tissues, viruses, bacteria. We're a machine as far as modern science is concerned. And this is true even though the most recent forms of science like quantum physics or systems theory or complexity theory, meditation research have shown that the mind is matter isn't as real as we think. It's not as solid as we think. It's not as intangible as we think. And that mind itself has impacts. The way we think, the way we focus our attention, the way we relate to our emotions and our bodies, sculpts the way our nervous systems operate, sculpts the way our genomes get read. Okay, so our whole minds and bodies are very fluid. And mind is like the growing edge. It's the part of us that's the most fluid and the most intelligent. It's the most capable of, being open to new experience and information and really adapting, having choices, having freedom. So a culture so both sides of the culture that I was raised in, modern materialism says you don't even have a mind, so forget about it. Okay, you're not going to do anything. Your mind is not going to do anything. And even in a sense, the Christian, the Catholic culture, the authoritarian religion, the patriarchal religion that I was raised in says, don't think, just follow orders. Just do the right thing. So I think that, this is why one of the things about Indian culture that I think attracts me so much and is so central to the future of the planet. That to really have a culture that understands the power of the mind to create well-being or misery, right? Because it can do both. And in a way, look at capitalism today is an expression of the mind driven by self-protective instincts or greed or scarcity or aggression can destroy societies, people, the planet. That's what it's doing. And that's the power of the mind that's doing that. It's everybody who's conditioned to be part of that engine of consumption, of exploitation, of achieving. Again, not to say that achievement is wrong or that we shouldn't aspire to do a lot with our lives, but we need to have the space and the freedom and the encouragement to ask ourselves what is that we really want to do? What is really going to benefit ourselves? What's going to benefit our families, what's going to benefit our communities. And I think the new science actually is coming around to showing that both, the capacity to open your mind, to direct your attention with training, with skill, and the heart, like the importance of connecting to other people, right? And of caring, belonging, feeling part of a community, part of something. These are what make us healthy and happy. Not, after a certain amount of consumption, whatever it is, $30,000 a year or $40,000 a year, after a certain amount of consumption of your basic needs are being met, safety, food, education, health, having more doesn't improve your well-being. It just doesn't. It's a myth. And so the idea of continually pursuing that is really kind of a fantasy, actually, and it's kind of it is, I think, an addiction, as well as the idea that we as individuals, can do it alone. right? And understanding that we really need each other, and we need community, and we need to belong. We need to create communities that are, loving communities and accepting communities. And given that we live in this world that's been dominated by colonialism and capitalism, we need to know that in order to create those spaces in our own mind and in our own communities, we need to resist the dominant brainwashing. We need to gather in groups like this where we're thinking about, what is really true for me, or what is really helpful for me, and whether that be, it could be in a corporation if you have wise enough leaders, but again, they're part of the grid. So a lot of times when we work with people, we have a program we call Boundless Leadership, which is really about how to lead yourself in a crazy world, right? In a crazy social systems. You need to find others who are like-minded, you need to find people who do support your questioning, your suffering the effects of the way our lives operate, and who encourage you that you have what it takes to find a way to well-being, to happiness, and as a community, to belonging. Yeah.
This collaborative community feeling that is the essence of Eastern philosophy has always been at loggerheads with the Western approach, which gives importance to gain and the individual profit and the success-oriented discourses. There have also been lots of anti-scientific approaches like homeopathy and so many approaches that are against Western science pertaining to health, mental well-being, communication, personality development. And they continue to be there. There are, in the field of training and coaching, many approaches like NLP, which are maybe semi-scientific or pseudoscience also, as some call it. But in the way you define Western science, or you define science as such, which is broader and more liberal, I suppose they're all valid approaches. Whatever gives happiness and well-being to the individual, to the human being, to human society is valid. And I was wondering before I met you and heard you speak about this, whether you would approve of NLP and such approaches, because they're not all scientifically proven. Now, I think you've already answered my question, but I would still like to hear your views on it.
Yeah, so for those who are not familiar with NLP, it's neuro-linguistic programming. It's an approach to, it grows out of hypnotherapy in the West, which is using the mind to transform the way the mind works and the way the body operates. And while, methodologies like this, there's a lot of methodologies that are alternative, including formulations of mindfulness that I think can be helpful and effective. I think the important thing to understand is that it's true, our minds have the power to transform our brains, our nervous systems, the way our genomes are operating. And there are, most Western science doesn't, sort of conventional Western science doesn't really address that. Psychotherapy in general is a little different, right? Psychotherapy, of which NLP is a type, recognizes that the mind, needs to be educated or needs to be accessed or tapped. But then how do you actually, what methods do you use? I think there are many methods. I think, using imagery, which is one of the techniques, or using sounds or touching the body. This is becoming extremely important in the current research on trauma, right? Because we're understanding that, words only go so far, right? And so talk therapy is focused on helping us understand ourselves and the world differently through another person's lens. But once we understand ourselves and the world differently, what do we do about it? How do we actually change? A lot of people do talk therapy and find the same old patterns keep appearing, right? And so learning how to use the other languages of the human nervous system, right? So only 10% of the nervous system operates on language, right? Nervous system, parts of like the right brain use imagery. The older limbic brain uses sound and resonance, speech tone, and the body uses breath and movement. And of course, within we talked a little bit about this within the world of meditation. Meditation isn't just mindfulness. Meditation involves transforming the heart, but also there's what we call an embodied approach to meditation, which is expressed in tantric practices where imagery is used. Art, essentially the arts. It's like poetry. Like talking to the older parts of our nervous system matters. Understanding the languages of the different layers of our being and speaking to them is essential to really deep change and radical change. But that's what the arts make possible. And of course there are, in a way, I see Tantra as an art-based meditation process, right? Including it's also a little bit exercise-based because it uses breath so much, right? Breath and movement. So I think that in general, the whole idea of speaking to these other layers of our being is essential to speeding the healing and transformation and to deepening it into the older parts of our nervous system and our psyche.
Veronica, having lived in the Asian countries, how far have you explored Asian art and Asian literature also in the process of healing and dealing with trauma and in your work?
So for me personally, my passion when it comes to culture starts with language. I started learning languages since I was a little kid. And so in my 20s, I learned Chinese. So I've been quite influenced by the Chinese philosophy, Lao-Tzu, the father of Taoism. And what has influenced me is many of the principles that I think are a really nice balance to the principles that we get in the West. For example, patience is not something that we typically tend to have in the West. And being able to be patient, that means that you're able to listen, to active listening. So that's one of the things. Being more humble. And for example, when I first came to Asia and I was in meetings, very often people would not participate in public meetings or when we had a Q&A. And my first assumption was to think that these people were not qualified, when in reality, very often in Asia, is more of a humility and is more of a sign of respect. And so it's kind of trying to reframe the way that you look at situations. So for me, it's always more holistically about the culture and how we try to very often remove the cultural lenses that we have when we see a situation. For example, one of the stories that I always share is that in one of my first jobs in Shanghai, I was a manager. And when I came back to the office after a lunch break, I saw that my colleague was like this, sleeping on the desk. And in the West, this is a big no. It's not acceptable. It's not respectful. So being new in the country, in Asia, I thought it was unacceptable. And I did not remove my cultural lenses. And I scolded that colleague. And I told her that it was not acceptable, that our clients would be extremely upset and that they would think that it was very a sign of disrespect. And later on, of course, I learned that this is something that is not only common, but is very acceptable and even encouraged in Asia. So I was very ashamed of my behavior. But again, this goes back to that humility of understanding that culture is also about making mistakes, and it's also about recognizing when you have an opportunity to grow and to be more curious. I think curiosity is one of the other big themes of Taoism. And one of the things that I found very interesting is that in the West, when we think about curiosity, we tend to think about curiosity towards others. And why do other people do this? Or why do other people sleep on the desk? But the curiosity that I found is the most powerful and the most empowering is a curiosity towards yourself. And understanding, why do I think that this is not acceptable? And why do I behave this way? And why do I have this perspective or these cultural lenses. And so I think it's on these principles that I've really learned a lot in these 23 years, I think now. So quite a long time.
So lovely to listen to your lived experiences in Asia. Well, we all know that no culture, no philosophy is complete and perfect. Every philosophy and every approach has its chinks. There are problems everywhere. There is so much disorder and chaos in Asia compared to the West, as we all know from our lived experience also. That brings us to the larger picture of Buddhism. Even as we talk about the healing powers of Buddhism, I'm also deeply disturbed to think about the genocide in Myanmar, and it would be totally unfair and incomplete in this discourse not to talk about that also. Because everything is prone to politicization. And what about Buddhist nationalism and the Rohingyas? What is your view on that?
Yeah, well, again, I think any, ideology, any human system of culture can, is only as good as the humans using it. And so ultimately, we can't really put the hands, the power in the hands of the program, of the culture, of the especially identity. I mean, in a way, that's exactly the opposite of Buddhist, values. Well, the same happens in the West. I mean, the West has, Christian values are supposed to be selflessness and loving all living beings. And look what Christian, white Christian Western culture has done. So I think we have to all be very skeptical about ideology and about any tradition that we get too attached to. Right? Ultimately, we have to value what's most important is our awareness. You were talking about self-awareness or openness, humility in the face of the world that or others we don't understand. And see, again, normally, part of our self-protective instinct is to try to grab hold of things. And our identities and our worldviews are the main things we grab hold of. And so we need to understand that tendency as limiting, and binding. It's a bondage. And, but certainly any culture is subject to being corrupted in that way and being abused in that way. And we have to have a humility as humans, right? That it's hard for us to have the confidence or to be prepared to find the freedom within ourselves to let go of our identity, let go of our worldview, and be fully present and nakedly as just a human being with other human beings in the face of reality, right? So that's the best I can say about that.
Well, easier said than done, because there is such growing intolerance and xenophobia spreading everywhere in the world, in India also, everywhere. As individuals, maybe we can have a better sense of self-awareness and well-being, but as a society, I see a very bleak picture.
Yeah. An addendum in terms of whatever you're saying is we need to, religions actually have been the greatest unifying force in cultures. They've allowed us to have a sense of community on a very large scale, right? And normally, as we're wired biologically, we're not really wired to have a sense of belonging in large groups. They say that there's the Dunbar number. The anthropologists have found you can't really feel close to more than 250 people. So how do we create a sense of community that has 250 million or 2.5 billion? And we do that through culture, identity, worldview. But unfortunately, if we don't, if we lock into those in fear, they become weapons. They're weaponized against ourselves and against others. And so at this point in human history, when, one of the things that colonialism has done is help unify the planet, right? And, technology has made us aware so we can, through social media, see what people are doing on the other side of the planet. We need to overcome this sense of, identity as, I belong to this religion or this region, and develop a sense of identity as humans, as fellow humans, and even as humbler identity as living beings and as part of a planet. And so there has to be a larger stretch. Now, I think all religions have this side of being open that needs to be built on, right? We need to have the genuine capacity to be open, come together in a kind of intercultural, common human family, right? And spiritual interfaith family. And we need to do this intentionally because we can't wait for even our religious leaders, right? We each have to think about it ourselves. How are we going to expand our sense of cultural identity, as you were describing, Veronica, so that we really can be planetary citizens and feel at home and safe with our fellow humans, whatever they're up to.
As an educator, as a teacher, I feel that maybe the fault lies with education and the way we have not led our students, our posterity, to think in the right direction. We have disabled them, we have maimed them, injured them, leading them to think wrongly, indoctrinating them with the wrong ideologies. Well, that also gives us hope. Now that we talk about all this, we are increasingly aware as a society, I'm sure. It is so much better than before, even though on the one side, the picture is rather bleak. On the other side, there's continuing ongoing discussions on all this. People are increasingly open to these discussions. There's a lot of hope also. What do you think, Veronica?
I would agree with that, and that's why I'm here today, because I think, yes, unfortunately, very often the systems fail us, and what we see now in the US, for example, is quite sad. All this reaction, or this attack towards values like diversity, equity, and inclusion. So the picture is pretty dark, but at the same time, what we're doing today, it means that for me there is hope. There is hope in bringing people together. I think technology is an amazing enabler to allow us to share our story. And so, for example, even at an individual level, I do a lot of advocacy. I go to summits. I was 2 weeks ago in a DEI summit in Hong Kong talking about these topics, cultural inclusion and things like these. And so very often when we look at the big picture, we can get depressed because we feel frustrated and we feel that we can't do anything. But the truth is the power of one is very important. And so what can you do today? I like writing, so I use my passion to advocate for things that I believe in. We all want to have a sense of belonging, so where can you go? Where can you meet with people to join forces? So I'm positive.
The session is open for discussion. Please feel free to talk to the speakers. And
I was listening to your session very carefully because this topic is very much close to my heart. So, sir, I want to ask one question about Khalil Gibran. Because Khalil Gibran, see, Gibran is very close to my heart because Prophet is my favorite book. Whenever I'm having some issues, I go to the Prophet. So the Prophet ends like this. After some time, another woman will bear me. So Gibran is a person who was born and brought up in an Abrahamic tradition, right? See, the end of the Prophet is like, it is saying about the rebirth. So it is having no connection with any Abrahamic tradition as far as I know. Pardon me if I'm wrong, because it is Eastern philosophy. So why do you feel that, why Gibran has wrote this? Was he having a great influence on Eastern philosophy while writing the Prophet? I want to know your perspective.
Thank you so much for your question. I don't know, I've read the Prophet, but I don't know his work that well. But certainly, throughout history, humans have learned from each other, right? And we have this notion of cultures as very separate, but there's been a tremendous amount of cross-cultural exchange, especially in the realm of, the what used to be the Silk Road, right? Between India and China and the Middle East. So there's a lot of influence, on Abrahamic traditions that comes from Indic traditions, in my view, and Chinese traditions as well, in science and technology especially. So I see that as part of the growth. Like there are, in my view, I'm also interested in people like Thomas Merton, for example, from the Christian tradition, or, even His Holiness the Dalai Lama is a reformer of the Tibetan tradition. People who I call spiritual activists, people who try to take their tradition, value the roots, but also expand. And I think this is extremely important, and expand through dialogue with other traditions and also through their own human experience. Because these things, they have to grow or they die. This is the culture of living things, So, yeah, thank you for sharing that. Yeah.
It was an interesting conversation. My doubt is, sir, I love profit, I love loss, I love competition, I love capitalism. In relative terms or in duality, we need everything. Without competition, profit, loss, money, we can't survive in this duality. In ultimate terms, there is no such things, profit, loss. So I don't regret. I don't feel guilty, because spirituality is for wealthy people, extremely rich people. Buddha taught his spirituality to affluent society, not to poor people. Poor people need food, shelter, clothing, basic needs, and complete their desires. Then only they have to learn about spirituality and meditation. Please show some more light on it. Thank you.
Yeah, no, I think this is absolutely true. And this is again the conference, the meeting we were having with Chandran Nair, and AJ, that we need to have basic human needs met before we can, learn to discover ourselves. We need to feel safe. We need to be healthy. We need to be, fed, sheltered, and that I think is a, part of the culture that we all have to have a collective will to recognize that this is necessary, as well as another really I think sick part of Western culture is the notion that one person can be happy while others are suffering, right? That somehow the whole idea of Western culture is you get enough wealth and power that you can insulate yourself from the suffering of others, which is completely sick, and it's not really possible. And I think this understanding, the science is all showing us, nobody wants to listen. Like even contemporary, conventional, modern, Western science is showing us this is not true, that people need certain degree of safety and comfort before they can flourish, and that past a certain amount, it's not helping. And so the hoarding that that's encouraged in Western ideology and capitalism, the idea that no amount of wealth is too big, is too great, you can never have enough, right, is really a disease. And I think we have to kind of recognize this, because it also seems for those of us who are stuck in struggling, in poverty, or working too hard, drudgery and so on, we want to have a fantasy of escape. So very often we idealize, at least in Western culture, we're taught to idealize these wealthy people as the sort of, who I should be. And I think it's important that we critique this myth and recognize that's not possible. That's not a possible practical, it's not even for the people who are the billionaires. Like I treat people who are billionaires. They're not such happy people, okay? And part of the reason is they don't belong. They're all isolated in their little, bubble of wealth and privilege. But again, there's, centuries of misunderstanding of what human beings need that are behind this engine. Hopefully our current understanding that, of what we really need to connect with one another, to feel safe and belonging, to be well cared for, that it'll change this delusion, and people will, take much more seriously the importance of their connection to others, and maybe as Chandran is suggesting, maybe that includes the states or authorities who are willing to put limits or to regulate how wealth is distributed, how it's spent, and to really take care of all of us, in any community, any nation, or on the planet. We need to be thinking like this. Yeah. So thank you for your question.
To add to what you were saying, capitalism, the problem with capitalism is that it perpetrates itself. It increases the divide between the rich and the poor. You don't agree? Capitalism thrives on spreading itself, like colonialism does. Capitalism is not just about making money and meeting your material needs. It is much more than that. I think that is where the problem lies, like you were saying, to add to what you said.
I work with her. I'm also with the. I'm also into preaching, a spiritual like kind of a zone right now, and I am actually having. Can you hear me? Sorry, I'm having healers around my aura. I believe in spirituality as well. So, what's your take on manifestation, which is going right now these days? People are seeing angel numbers like 1111. Many things are going on. So, I mean, you are also into it. So, what's your take on that?
Okay.
Okay.
Yeah, I think that it's a way of emphasizing the power of the mind, but I don't know that it's quite, literally, yeah. I'm not sure I would put my, invest my mind there. I think, we do need to think about the consequences of where we put our attention, and what thoughts we have, what emotions are in our bodies, what behaviors we have. And they do, this is karma, they do create our lives, and together with others. There's also collective karma. So in that sense, manifestation, but the notion of, thinking positively in order to, create some desire, to fulfill some desire, is, I think not grounded. It's because it leaves people vulnerable to wishful thinking, right? And so I think that it's one of these self-help commodities that I think are very saleable, because people are vulnerable and needy, and they want happiness, and but if there's any truth to it at all, it's simply that yes, we need to think about what the power of our minds and where we're putting them, but I think then we need a lot of instruction about exactly what to do with our minds and our hearts and our bodies, and I don't think just manifesting is going to work.
Thank you, Dr. JoeLoizzo and Veronica Llorca-Smith and Dr. Kalyani Vallath for such an insightful and inspiring discussion. We truly appreciate your time and perspectives.